It began on a weekday evening, just before sunset, when the rhythm of Midtown Manhattan typically thins from its daily torrent of commerce into a quieter hum of taxis, briefcases, and dinners delayed. At exactly 6:30 post-meridiem on Park Avenue, one of the most surveilled and high-security corridors in the Western world, a man walked into a high-rise office building carrying an M4 rifle. He did not conceal it. He did not attempt to sneak in through a freight entrance, nor did he bypass metal detectors with clever design. He walked through the front door, in full-body armor, carrying a high-powered assault weapon in broad daylight, into a building housing the headquarters of the National Football League and one of the world's largest private equity firms, the Blackstone Group. The building was 44 stories tall, secured, hardened, post-September 11th, and equipped with round-the-clock private security. Yet within seconds, the shooter turned right inside the lobby and opened fire. He killed a woman taking cover behind a pillar. He shot a security officer near the elevators. He continued spraying bullets indiscriminately, causing hundreds to flee and dozens to barricade themselves behind office furniture. By the time the shooting ended, 4 civilians were dead, including a 36-year-old off-duty New York Police Department officer Didarel Islam, a Bangladeshi immigrant, and a 3.5-year veteran of the force, whose wife is now pregnant with their 3rd child. The shooter, identified as 27-year-old Shane Tamura of Las Vegas, Nevada, ended his life on the 33rd floor of the building, with a single shot to the head. The NYPD confirmed Tamura had driven across the country in a black BMW, carrying a revolver, rifle magazines, ammunition, a prescription drug bottle in his name, and a loaded secondary weapon. His attack lasted less than 20 minutes, but its impact is likely to reverberate for years. This was not simply a random act of violence. It was a deliberate breach at the nexus of corporate power, public visibility, and law enforcement presence. And it raises a set of difficult, deeply unsettling questions. Why did Tamura target this specific building? Why the NFL? Why Blackstone? Why New York and not Washington? And why now? This is not the first time America has been confronted with a lone gunman, mental health warnings, and high-powered rifles. But the specifics of this case, the journey across multiple states, the selection of Midtown Manhattan, the proximity to national institutions and media networks, and the symbolic resonance of the targets, point to something far more complex than personal rage. To understand what happened and what it may mean going forward, we must dissect this event across 7 strategic layers. From the profile of the attacker to the institutional vulnerabilities it exposes, from the possible motivations to the political terrain it destabilizes, from law enforcement protocols to federal coordination to the broader ideological climate in which this kind of violence is now both possible and perhaps, for some, inevitable. This is not about one shooter. This is about the system that produced him, failed to stop him, and will now attempt to explain him away. We begin with the man himself. Shane Tamura, 27 years old, a resident of Las Vegas. No known criminal record, but a documented history of mental illness. That phrase, documented history, is often used by media outlets as a form of shorthand, but it matters what kind of history it was. Was Tamura institutionalized? Was he medicated? Was he flagged by state or federal databases that interface with background checks? We do not know yet. But we do know this. Tamura legally owned firearms. He maintained prescriptions. He lived, reportedly, in a gated community. He was not homeless, nor destitute, nor on the fringes of society in any visible way. He was, by all outward appearances, ordinary, until he was not. The journey from Las Vegas to New York City spans over 2,600 miles across state borders, federal jurisdictions, and multiple surveillance networks. It is inconceivable that no red flags were triggered. A man in full body armor, carrying multiple firearms, driving a personally registered vehicle across 5 or more states with documented mental health issues and a clear, traceable weapons purchase history. This was not someone who slipped through the cracks. This was someone the system chose not to stop. And that system, both local and federal, now finds itself once again in damage control mode. Because the moment Tamura stepped out of his vehicle on Park Avenue, the illusion of control evaporated. In the aftermath, officials emphasized his mental illness, as they have done before. But what they have not explained is why a mentally ill man was able to plan, coordinate, and execute an attack at a location that houses multiple soft and hard targets of national interest. This was not a grocery store. This was not a school. This was not a religious institution. It was a high-rise fortress in Midtown Manhattan, a location protected by multiple layers of private security, overlapping with NYPD patrols, intelligence fusion centers, and federal liaisons. Tamura chose this building for a reason, and that reason remains concealed behind euphemisms like mental illness and tragedy. But this is not just a tragedy. It is a signal, and like all geopolitical signals, it demands to be decoded. The choice of location was not random. 345 Park Avenue is not simply another commercial building in New York City. It stands as a modern-day citadel, layered in glass, steel, and security, housing 2 institutions that symbolize distinct pillars of American influence. On one side, the National Football League. On the other, Blackstone Group. Sports and finance. Culture and capital. Entertainment and enterprise. To the average passerby, the NFL represents leisure, national pride, and the spectacle of American exceptionalism played out every Sunday. To the more analytical observer, it represents a multi-billion-dollar cultural engine, with deep connections to media conglomerates, public sentiment, and national rituals. The NFL is more than football. It is narrative management, community identity, and, increasingly, political terrain. Blackstone, by contrast, is neither cultural nor visible. It operates in the shadows, yet exerts gravitational pull over pension funds, real estate portfolios, and global infrastructure. With assets under management exceeding $1 trillion, Blackstone is not merely a company. It is a force field. Together, these institutions represent 2 sides of American soft power, the spectacle of unity and the machinery of elite finance. And they share an address. For a gunman to target this site, in this manner, raises the possibility that his act was more than personal disintegration. It may have been symbolic. Whether Tamura knew the specifics of his target, or whether he perceived it as a general node of elite power, remains unknown. But the effect is undeniable. When blood is shed in a building like this, it sends a signal far beyond the physical boundaries of Park Avenue. It disrupts the public perception of safety in a place that was supposed to be immune. It exposes the limitations of security infrastructure, not in vulnerable communities, but in the economic and cultural heart of the country. And it raises the specter of targeted ideological violence, even if cloaked in mental illness. Let us consider what Tamura may have seen from his perspective. A building full of executives, athletes, security guards, and media professionals. The epicenter of elite decision-making, protected by cameras, guards, and architecture. A location that few civilians ever enter without clearance, yet which stands visible to all just beyond reach. To enter such a place armed with an M4 rifle, wearing body armor, in broad daylight, is not simply suicidal. It is declarative. It challenges the hierarchy of access. It pierces the illusion that class, money, or corporate prestige can shield anyone from the consequences of systemic failure. This, again, does not absolve the shooter of responsibility, but it places the act within a frame far larger than personal despair. If Shane Tamura was mentally unstable, the question must still be asked: why was his instability drawn to this building? Why not a mall? Why not a school? Why not a random intersection? Why here? The answer may lie in the convergence of meaning. For the disillusioned mind, the NFL and Blackstone may represent everything that feels inaccessible, manipulative, and untouchable. They do not govern, but they shape what people see. They do not legislate, but they fund those who do. They are not military, but they project power. And this fusion of cultural and financial dominance, located on one of the most famous streets in the United States, becomes a symbolic target, even if the attacker himself cannot articulate the reasons. This is not the first time high-profile institutions have come under direct assault by lone actors. But when such institutions are housed in civilian structures and operate under the assumption of invulnerability, they create vulnerabilities of their own. There is a pattern emerging over the past decade that is increasingly difficult to ignore. Shootings no longer limit themselves to predictable targets. They are becoming messages, aimed not at individuals, but at systems. Messages written in blood, delivered without warning, and aimed at the heart of perceived power. The federal response to this attack has so far been clinical. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is coordinating with the NYPD alongside the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department to piece together Tamura's movements, motivations, and connections. But the deeper issue is not one of logistics. It is one of meaning. Why does the United States, a nation that spends over $1 trillion per year on defense, intelligence, and homeland security, continue to face attacks of this nature from its own citizens with predictable frequency? The answer lies not in any one agency, but in the convergence of three dangerous forces. First, a society that produces psychological isolation at scale. Second, a legal framework that permits near unrestricted access to military-grade firearms. And third, a political climate that cultivates grievance without resolution. Shane Tamura may have had a mental illness, but mental illness alone does not explain a cross-country drive with loaded weapons, body armor, and tactical planning. It does not explain the selection of a symbolically loaded target. And it does not explain the consistent failure to prevent such individuals from acting. We are left, once again, not with closure, but with fragmentation. Multiple agencies will release multiple findings. The headlines will cycle forward, but the questions will remain open. Because this is not about one shooter. It is about a nation that continues to design the conditions for such violence to recur. Again and again. The hours following the Midtown shooting were, predictably, flooded with statements, press conferences, social media, condolences, flags lowered to half-staff, and a familiar vocabulary, and all used to shape the narrative before the facts were fully known. Lone wolf, mental illness, isolated incident. These phrases serve a function. They insulate institutions from deeper accountability. They position the event as an anomaly rather than a signal. But the facts tell a more troubling story. Shane Tamura had a history of mental health issues. That history was documented, but not acted upon. He owned multiple weapons, legally. He acquired ammunition, legally. He drove across the country, uninterrupted. And he entered a high-security building, unchallenged until it was too late. This is not failure at a single point. It is failure across the chain. Let us begin with the question of mental health. What precisely does it mean when an individual is described as mentally ill in the context of mass violence? In the United States, mental illness is not by itself grounds for restricting firearm access unless a court has adjudicated the person as a danger to themselves or others. Even then, the reporting system is fractured. Some states comply with federal databases. Others do not. Some psychiatrists report to law enforcement, "Mane donot." And even when red flags are raised, there is no federal standard for preemptive intervention. Tamura may have received prescriptions. He may have undergone treatment. But unless those interactions resulted in formal legal restrictions, they would not have prevented him from acquiring firearms. The phrase, "documented mental illness," becomes meaningless when that documentation lives in silos. Medical records are private. Law enforcement databases are compartmentalized. And unless the individual triggers a criminal case, the system remains blind. This is not a loophole. It is design, a design that values privacy over preemption, rights over risk, and bureaucracy over integration. Tamura's cross-country journey adds another layer to this failure. From Nevada to New York, he crossed multiple state lines, each with its own enforcement jurisdiction, each with its own standards for probable cause. At no point was his vehicle stopped. At no point was he flagged. He carried a revolver, a high-powered rifle, magazines, ammunition, and body armor. All of this legally purchased. All of this concealed inside a civilian vehicle. And all of it invisible to the architecture of prevention. When law enforcement responded to the shooting, their actions were swift, coordinated, and brave. NYPD officers entered a building under fire. They escorted civilians floor by floor. They located the shooter, already dead from a self-inflicted wound. But rapid response is not the same as prevention. It is containment. And containment, after the fact, cannot undo what has already occurred. It cannot restore 4 lives. It cannot repair institutional credibility. And it cannot explain why no agency, in any jurisdiction, was aware of a heavily armed man driving into the most populated city in the country with intent to kill. There is a phrase in federal law enforcement, "known to authorities." It refers to suspects who appear in databases, alerts, or previous investigations. Tamura, as of this writing, was not known. Despite a mental health history, despite gun ownership, despite a long-distance journey with tactical preparation, he did not trigger the system because the system was not designed to detect his profile. He was not affiliated with a known terrorist group. He was not on a watch list. He did not commit a crime until the moment he did. And by then, the system had already failed. This breakdown raises uncomfortable questions. Should mental health providers be required to report high-risk patients? Should cross-state gun transport be tracked? Should body armor purchases trigger alerts? Each of these questions touches the core of American political culture: privacy, liberty, individual rights, and the constitutional scaffolding that surrounds the Second Amendment. But when 4 people die in a Midtown office tower, including a decorated police officer, the calculus must change. The issue is not whether every mentally ill person is dangerous. They are not. The issue is whether the current architecture of public safety is capable of distinguishing risk from rights before blood is spilled. In Tamura's case, the answer was no. And the consequences are now irreversible. The deeper concern, however, is what this pattern reveals. Mass shootings in the United States no longer follow a singular narrative. They occur in schools, in nightclubs, in churches, in malls, and now in skyscrapers that house the nation's most powerful institutions. Each time, the suspect is said to have slipped through the cracks. But perhaps the problem is not the cracks. Perhaps the problem is the design. The United States has, over the past 3 decades, evolved into a society where mass shootings are not aberrations, but rituals. From Columbine in 1999, to Virginia Tech, to Sandy Hook, to Pulse nightclub, to Las Vegas, to Uvalde. Each attack was labeled a national tragedy. Each prompted short-lived outrage. Each generated promises of reform. And each faded into the next. The chronology of mass shootings is no longer isolated. It is cumulative. layered atop one another, forming a dark ledger of systemic breakdown. But as the pattern continues, the character of these attacks is shifting. They are becoming less about personal revenge and more about symbolic spectacle, less about individual relationships and more about institutions, less about targeting specific people and more about targeting what those people represent. This is the logic of asymmetric violence, where the attacker does not seek strategic victory, but perceptual disruption, where the target is not chosen for tactical advantage, but for symbolic weight. Shane Tamura's decision to attack 345 Park Avenue must be understood in this context. A location tied to the financial elite, a location tied to America's cultural mythos, a location heavily surveilled, yet vulnerable by design. In asymmetric conflict, attackers choose soft spots in hard systems. They weaponize visibility. They provoke overreaction. They force institutions to confront their weakest link, which is often the assumption of safety. Midtown Manhattan, like Capitol Hill, Wall Street, or Silicon Valley, is not just a place. It is a stage. It represents continuity, power, and control. And in an era of fragmentation, such symbols attract the disillusioned. There is a reason these attacks often end in suicide. The perpetrators do not plan for escape. They do not negotiate. They do not demand. They act to punctuate, to mark a moment in which their existence collides with the structure they perceive to be unjust, invisible, or unreachable. In past decades, such acts might have been classified as terrorism. But in the United States, where ideology is often internalized rather than organized, the term is rarely applied. Instead, the explanation defaults to mental illness, as if there is no political content in the choice of target, as if symbolism does not matter. But it does. A shooter does not walk into a grocery store in Buffalo, or a synagogue in Pittsburgh, or a high-rise on Park Avenue without believing that the act carries meaning. And meaning is what transforms violence from random to deliberate, from tragedy to statement. In geopolitical terms, this is a form of domestic insurgency, not coordinated, not ideological in the traditional sense, but insurgent in its function. It undermines public confidence and safety. It strains the credibility of institutions, and it forces a recalibration of what is considered secure. This is not a war in the conventional sense. There are no armies, no manifestos, no banners, but there is damage, strategic, psychological, and cumulative. Each act destabilizes something: trust, routines, social cohesion, and the sense that the most powerful nation on earth can protect its own people from itself. This internal erosion cannot be measured with troop deployments or budgets. It is felt in the quiet decisions people make to avoid public spaces, to question emergency response times, to wonder whether the building they work in is truly secure. In the wake of the Tamura shooting, employees of Blackstone and the NFL were escorted out by police, hands raised, eyes scanning, some sobbing, others silent, all of them aware that something unspoken had been broken. Not just the glass, not just the protocol, but the belief that they were protected by position. This is the true objective of asymmetric violence: to reveal the gap between perception and reality, to show that prestige cannot prevent blood, that wealth cannot shield from bullets, and that systems, no matter how fortified, are still human, still vulnerable, still penetrable. For every politician who promises never again, and for every executive who boosts building security in response, there is a deeper reckoning to be had. Why does the world's most advanced society produce so many individuals willing to die simply to make a point? What is it they believe that compels them to target symbols rather than people? And what does it say about the trajectory of American civilization when the very institutions meant to unify and elevate become magnets for destruction. These are not rhetorical questions. They are strategic ones. Because a nation cannot maintain global dominance if it cannot secure its own public squares. Every mass shooting in the United States follows a now familiar sequence. First, chaos. Then, coverage. Then, commentary. And finally, collapse into silence. It is not the silence of healing, but the silence of resignation, because the pattern has become predictable. And in geopolitics, predictability is not a sign of control. It is a sign of stagnation, of systems unable or unwilling to adapt. Within hours of the Midtown attack, press conferences were held. New York's mayor spoke of unity. The police commissioner mourned the fallen officer. Journalists gathered images of bullet casings, shattered glass, and terrified civilians. And networks scrambled for angles. Was it terrorism? Was it ideological? Was it preventable? Was it political? But within 48 hours, those questions will recede, replaced by the next crisis, the next scandal, the next election cycle talking point. This is not due to apathy. It is due to saturation. The American public has absorbed so much trauma that it no longer distinguishes between tragedy and routine. And that saturation has political consequences. Each shooting becomes a canvas onto which opposing factions project their narratives. For one side, it is a gun control issue. For the other, it is a mental health issue. For some, it is a failure of law enforcement. For others, a failure of culture. The result is gridlock, not only in Congress, but in cognition. Citizens no longer agree on what happened or why. They retreat into silos, each fed by algorithm, ideology, and selective outrage. And in this fractured environment, institutional trust erodes. Consider what the Midtown shooting reveals about that erosion. A high-rise in one of the most secured urban environments in the world, breached in minutes by a man with mental illness and body armor. A veteran police officer, off-duty, murdered before drawing his weapon. Hundreds of workers, barricading themselves behind desks and chairs in one of the wealthiest zip codes in the United States. And yet, within hours, the explanation reduced to familiar terms: unstable individual, lone actor, system worked as intended. But the system did not work. It responded, but it did not prevent. It mourned, but it did not adapt. And this cycle is no longer merely a policy failure. It is a legitimacy crisis. Because when the public perceives that the institutions designed to protect them cannot do so, they begin to question those institutions altogether. Law enforcement, mental health, politics, media, each becomes suspect. Each is viewed through a lens of performance rather than substance. Statements are dissected for spin. Motives are questioned before facts are known. And in that environment, the space for coherence collapses. This collapse has consequences, not only for domestic stability, but for global perception. When foreign powers assess the United States, they do not see only military budgets and stock markets. They see headlines. They see footage. They see a country where gunmen walk into schools, malls, and now skyscrapers with impunity. They see a nation at war with itself, not ideologically, but structurally. A nation where internal violence is no longer news, but noise. This perception matters, because in geopolitics, narrative is power. And when the dominant narrative of a superpower becomes one of dysfunction, that power begins to erode. Slowly, then all at once. Domestically, the consequences are more immediate. Public spaces become arenas of suspicion. Citizens scan exits before entering. Children rehearse lockdown drills, and adults carry the silent knowledge that safety is temporary. This is not how a stable society functions. It is how a society adapts to permanent insecurity. And in that adaptation, democracy changes. It becomes less participatory, more performative, less grounded in trust, more reliant on spectacle, and less capable of preventing the very threats it was built to address. The Midtown attack was not just a crime. It was a mirror. It reflected a system struggling to sustain its own mythologies about safety, control, and institutional competence. And in that reflection, a deeper truth emerges. America's most dangerous threat may not be foreign. It may be the normalization of its own internal disintegration. The United States operates the most extensive surveillance infrastructure in human history, from satellites orbiting Earth, to predictive algorithms embedded in domestic platforms, to a vast network of federal, state, and local intelligence sharing hubs. The apparatus exists. The question is not whether the tools are available. The question is whether they are functional. And in the case of Shane Tamura, the answer was no. Despite a documented history of mental illness, despite cross-country travel in a personally registered vehicle, despite the possession of multiple firearms, ammunition, and body armor, despite online activity that may yet reveal deeper motivations, no alert was triggered, no federal bulletin was issued, no interagency coordination preempted his arrival. And once again, the system designed to detect future threats responded only to past violence. To understand this failure, we must examine how modern counterterrorism frameworks are structured. Since the attacks of September 11, 2001, the architecture of American homeland security has evolved around the concept of coordination. Fusion centers, watch lists, joint task forces. These entities operate with one goal: prevention. To connect disparate data points, to identify patterns, and to intervene before an attack materializes. But these systems were built primarily to stop organized threats, terrorist cells, foreign operatives, no networks. They rely on communication intercepts, travel patterns, financial transactions, and group affiliation. Lone actors, by definition, evade these metrics. They do not communicate in predictable channels. They do not share intent with others. They do not move as part of a cell. They operate in silence until they erupt. And when the motive is personal, symbolic, or irrational, there is no flag to raise. In this respect, the Midtown shooting exposes the blind spot at the heart of modern security doctrine. The assumption that data can replace human judgment, the belief that algorithms can predict emotion, and the reliance on post-facto analysis rather than proactive intuition. Tamura did not act in coordination with any known group. He left no clear manifesto. He made no public threats. And yet, he was armed, armored, and deliberate. This points to a critical gap not in technology, but in institutional imagination. The agencies responsible for domestic security are trained to think in categories: threat or non-threat, networked or isolated, political or apolitical. But real-world violence does not follow these binaries. It emerges from fractured lives, ambiguous motivations, and hybrid ideologies. Tamura may have been mentally unstable, but he was not incoherent. He selected a target. He planned a route. He prepared his tools. He timed his entry. And he executed with deadly precision. This is not randomness. This is intent without explanation. And it is precisely that gap between behavior and motive that makes prevention so difficult. Traditional counterterrorism assumes motive precedes action. But in asymmetric domestic violence, action often precedes clarity. By the time motive is understood, the blood is already dried. To adapt to this reality, the security apparatus must evolve, not by expanding surveillance, not by militarizing cities, but by accepting that threat detection is no longer about ideology. It is about dislocation, social, psychological, economic, and cultural. The most dangerous individuals may not be on any watch list. They may not speak in codes. They may not align with known movements, but they carry within them a logic of rupture, a desire to interrupt, to announce themselves through destruction, and to die, not in anonymity, but in infamy. This type of threat defies traditional countermeasures. It demands not just technical upgrades, but cultural recalibration, training officers to see patterns beyond ideology, equipping mental health professionals to flag imminent risk even in gray areas, and creating channels where suspicion does not automatically trigger criminalization, but does trigger coordination. None of this is simple, but the current model is clearly insufficient, because no amount of cameras, scanners, or predictive software can replace the ability to ask the right questions before the first shot is fired. And in Tamura's case, no one asked, no one connected the dots, and no one imagined that a young man from Las Vegas could turn a Manhattan skyscraper into a battlefield. When the world watches the United States, it does not see only its presidents, its aircraft carriers, or its stock markets. It sees its cities, its public schools, its office buildings, its streets. These are the visible manifestations of American order, American modernity, and American strength. But when those spaces become recurring sites of bloodshed, when the sound of gunfire echoes in elementary classrooms, churches, supermarkets, and now high-rise towers on Park Avenue, the image projected to the world fractures. Because no superpower, no matter how wealthy or militarized, can sustain global leadership while bleeding internally from chronic, preventable trauma. The Midtown Manhattan shooting is not only a domestic tragedy, it is an international signal, a reminder that America's internal contradictions between liberty and security, between individual rights and collective safety, between innovation and fragmentation, are no longer theoretical. They are visible, tangible, and cumulative. Foreign observers, both allies and adversaries, study these events not as isolated crimes, but as indicators of deeper decay. They understand that internal instability weakens diplomatic leverage, that mass shootings signal political paralysis, that institutional failure, even in something as basic as building security, undermines the narrative of American exceptionalism. And in an era defined by great power competition, perception is strategic. When a single man can disrupt the financial and cultural heart of New York City, when 4 civilians can be murdered, despite the presence of armed security, federal coordination, and advanced surveillance systems, it sends a message. Not only about gun laws, not only about mental illness, but about the erosion of resilience. Because resilience is not tested in moments of victory. It is tested in repetition of failure. And on this metric, the United States is on the defensive. The geopolitical implications run deeper than headlines. International investors reevaluate risk exposure to U.S.-based assets. Diplomats question the safety of personnel stationed in American cities. Intelligence agencies update threat assessments, not for foreign attacks, but for domestic volatility. And authoritarian regimes exploit these incidents to reinforce their own narratives that liberal democracy is chaotic, that individual rights are corrosive, and that Western freedoms lead not to prosperity, but to anarchy. These narratives are false, but they are gaining traction, not because of ideology, but because of evidence. And every mass shooting becomes another data point, another frame, another reason to doubt. What, then, is the path forward? The answer does not lie in singular reforms. It lies in structural realignment. A nation that wishes to lead globally must first demonstrate that it can govern internally, that it can protect its children, its workers, its public spaces, that it can identify threats before they manifest and respond with clarity, not platitudes, that it can evolve not just technologically but morally, legally, and socially. The Midtown shooting was not just an act of violence. It was a failure of imagination across multiple levels of power. imagination to see what was coming, imagination to prevent what was possible, and imagination to build systems that are not just reactive, but anticipatory, until that failure is addressed with honesty, transparency, and strategy. The cycle will continue. The names will change. The weapons may vary, but the pattern will remain. And the world will watch, not with awe, but with concern. Because in the end, no empire falls all at once. It falls in increments, in warnings unheeded, in signals ignored, in lives lost, while systems look the other way. And unless the United States reclaims its capacity for foresight, it may find that its greatest adversary was never foreign, but the violence it normalized, the patterns it tolerated, and the trust it slowly allowed to die.